Welcome back to the OHSU Effect Inside Health and Science at OHSU. How much sleep did you get last night? Did you get enough? Probably not. Well, not enough sleep can lead to chronic diseases like diabetes. With me now are two experts in this field, Doctors Holger Link and Kyle Johnson. So both of you are at the OHSU Sleep Disorders Program. Tell me about the clinic and what kind of disorders you treat.
Well, we have a multidisciplinary clinic and program, including psychiatrists. I'm a child psychiatrist myself. There's two other psychiatrists in our clinic, Jonathan Emmons and Rachel Higginbotham. We also have adult pulmonologists, including Dr. Akram Khan and Gopal Alada, pediatric specialists, which include myself as a child psychiatrist, but also Dr. Link, who's here as a pediatric pulmonologist.
So lots of people in the clinic.
Lots of people in the clinic, and we can serve the whole range of ages from infancy through old age.
Well, let's talk about the common sleep disorders you treat then.
The gamut. We really pride ourselves on treating all the sleep disorders, which include sleep and breathing disorders, which is a big part of the practice. So obstructive sleep apnea in particular, but also insomnia, so difficulties falling asleep, staying asleep, getting up too early, not having restorative sleep, and is another big part of the practice. Dr. Link and I treat many kids, as does Dr. Super, and kids can have unusual behaviors in the middle of the night, like sleep terrors, sleepwalking, and those can be problematic. Narcolepsy, restless leg syndrome.
Wow. So what are some signs of a sleep disorder? I mean, how common are they in reality? How do people know they have one?
Well, the most common problem people have in this society is that they do not get enough sleep, which doesn't quite as widely recognized or appreciated. But I think the most common problem that we see is that just insufficient sleep. I think the second most common problem that we are consulted for is obstructive sleep apnea, so problems with sleep disruption, noisy breathing. And then a chief complaint that the patients have when they come and see us is that either the adult or child wake up in the morning and they just don't feel right. They feel like they have spent enough time in bed, but they just feel groggy, they feel grumpy and grouchy, and they have excessive sleepiness during the daytime. In children, we may see behavior disruption, and some kids have symptoms similar to ADHD or attention deficit hyperactivity syndrome. And because you're a pediatrician, oftentimes the parent will bring the child, or there'll be a concern from the teachers that the child has problems paying attention in school or being disruptive during class.
So it's interesting that those type of behavior problems can be traced back to sleep problems, right?
They can, yes. One area of interest for me is autism spectrum disorders in sleep. And the vast majority of kids that are on the spectrum have insomnia that can be quite incapacitating, cause a lot of distress for the kid, for the family. And it can be treated both with behavioral interventions and sometimes with medications if needed.
Let's talk about more of those treatments. You talk about medications, sleeping devices. Talk about those.
When the first step when we see a patient, a child, or an adult is to really take a very thorough history evaluation of the child's sleep habits, sleep duration, sleep quality, any unusual activity during the night like snoring, noisy breathing, heavy breathing, unusual awakenings like in children, night terrors or nightmares. So the first step is really to do a very thorough evaluation of the history, and then once we have that will guide us towards more of an organic evaluation for more of an organic problem like sleep apnea, for example, versus more of a behavioral or we'll call it parasomnia, which is sort of unusual behaviors during the night. And then according to that, we will tailor the therapy. We are concerned more about something like sleep apnea. That can be difficult to predict just based on the history and the examination. So oftentimes these kids or adults will go on to then have further evaluation in the sleep laboratory to determine if they have something like sleep apnea, which would have to be treated.
Well, I do want to come back to the sleep lab because I think a lot of people will be interested in that. But first, what about snoring? Is snoring always a sign of a sleep disorder, or are you just a snorer?
It's one of the main risk factors for sleep disorder breathing or obstructive sleep apnea, but a big proportion of people that snore do not have sleep apnea. So in kids, about 20% of kids snore periodically, 10% of them may snore almost every night, and only a fifth of those will actually have obstructive sleep apnea. So one of the biggest things we do is actually rule out sleep apnea in a child, I'm talking about kids now, that are snoring routinely.
Well, let's just talk about some general sleep advice. I mean, how much sleep should kids get?
Depends on age. The young newborns are sleeping machines, so they're sleeping the majority of time, upwards of 14, 16 hours in a 24-hour period of time. And then you have infants that are starting to nap and consolidate their sleep at night, so maybe closer to 14 hours in a 24-hour period of time. And then you got the kind of preschool age kids that are closer to 12 to 13 hours, and then school age kids closer to 10 hours. And then a big surprise from research is that adolescents need almost as much sleep as the junior high kids, or school age kids. So teenagers need closer to 8.5 to 9 hours of sleep, and the majority of them are not getting that. And so that's causing problems during the day, including sleepiness, fatigue, even depression, problems concentrating, and so forth. And then, of course, adolescents are getting behind the wheel and increase the risk of motor vehicle accidents.
What about adults? How much sleep do adults need?
I think the research shows closer to 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. You don't want to be sleeping too much or too little. If you're doing either one of those, it could be a sign that there's a medical problem or could lead or exacerbate medical problems.
Right.
Go ahead.
Well, and the research tells us that that about a third of all adults in the United States get 6 hours of sleep or less, and only about a third of the adults actually get those 8 hours of sleep per night. So as a society, we are chronically sleep deprived.
And that can lead to some pretty serious conditions, from what I understand, right? If you consistently get a lack of sleep.
Correct. Well, Dr. Johnson mentioned one of the most serious potential effects of sleep deprivation, which is car accidents. So there's quite a high number of accidents that are related to drowsiness, falling asleep on the wheel, and particular young drivers like teenagers are at very high risk for having serious outcomes in that regard. There is now more and more data coming out on insufficient sleep causing chronic inflammatory changes within the body, and chronic inflammatory changes in turn can be associated with further complications down in the future related to cardiovascular disease, like increased risk potentially for heart attacks and strokes. There's also, like you mentioned, increased risk for having problems with your metabolism, like being at increased risk for having poorly controlled diabetes, increased risk for possibly having elevated blood pressure. So there's still ongoing research, but the data so far is pointing in the direction of just being sleep deprived 6 hours or less per night can potentially contribute to those conditions.
Well, why do we need less sleep as we age?
I don't know a good answer for that outside of brain maturation. We know, kids are laying down synapses at a young age and making connections, and then later in adolescence, there's pruning going on. I think all that takes energy and rest, and there's less of that as we get older. So it's a great question, which I don't have a full answer, but that'd be my best guess.
What about conditions for sleeping? What are the best conditions for sleeping?
Well, the best conditions are, I would say, the fewer electronic devices, the better. And I think part of the answer, maybe why we sleep less now, even less than we should as we get older, is that we have a lot of exposure to electronic devices like television, computers, video games, and teenagers texting, smartphones. So I think the electronic devices clearly cut away a lot of our sleep time that we should be getting. So the best environment is one where you don't have exposure to electronics before going to bed. So for kids, they shouldn't watch TV right before bedtime. They shouldn't have a computer in their bedroom. They should not have access to their smartphone in their bedroom on their own. The bedroom should be dark. It should be the right temperature, ideally not too hot, not too cold. Should be quiet. It's recommended you don't have a big meal right before going to bed, because that can actually affect your ability to fall asleep. You shouldn't exercise right before going to bed, because it can disturb, your body's regulation and make it hard to fall asleep. And then one thing maybe more pertinent to adults is that some adults may be tempted to drink some alcoholic beverages just before going to bed. They think they might help you fall asleep. In fact, you might fall asleep a bit more quickly, but then subsequently, as the alcohol wears off after a few hours, you'll actually have much worse sleep quality during the rest of the night. So it's a very bad idea to try to relax in the evening with an alcoholic drink and then subsequently have much worse sleep and actually feel much less rested during the daytime.
Well, we have a lot more to talk about. Can you guys stick around?
Sure.
All right, more of the OHSU effect next on KXL.